you still hear that email?
And good afternoon and welcome back to the Cape Town Press Club at Home, brought to you today with the generous support of Pan MacMillan, and thank you to our technical producer, Margriet Groenewold. Today is a bit different because I will be on the opposite side of our virtual podium and handing over the chair for the session to Judith February of the Wits School of Governance. She was Executive Director of the HSRC's Democracy and Governance Unit and also the head of IDAS's South African Governance Programme for 9 years. She has worked extensively on issues of good governance, transparency and accountability, with a focus on corruption, parliamentary oversight and institutional design. Her book, Turning and Turning, Exploring the Complexities of South Africa's Democracy, was published also by Pan MacMillan. So I'm going to hand over now to you, Judith, and it's all yours. You are the chair today.
Thank you very much, Brent. I'm the chair, and I'm delighted to be able to do this book launch with you on another excellent contribution, Rattling the Cage, Reflections on Democratic South Africa. So Brent's title says chairperson, but that is chairperson of the Cape Town Press Club, and he's been chair since 2013. But he is a widely published author. He's also written previously for the Mail and Guardian, This is Africa and New Africa Analysis in London. And Brent's had many forays and Primary Coloured, you might all remember, but also more recently, the most beautiful and empathetic book on his own childhood called A Childhood Made Up. And if you haven't read that, you certainly should. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Rattling the Cage today. So Brent, it's great to be in conversation with you. To talk about this very insightful book of critical essays. I thought that I would just start with asking you about the writing process and how it is that you moved from A Childhood Made Up, a beautiful, beautiful memoir, which I so enjoyed, and then to writing about the more sort of difficult issues facing our country. What was the mind shift that was needed for you in terms of going from the memoir to the set of critical essays? And talk to us a little bit about your writing process.
Well, something which it didn't occur to me at the time, so it wasn't really conscious. But I found that, when the Childhood Made Up, the memoir, it dealt with me revisiting my childhood and actually looking at the story that I had always told myself about how I'd grown up and actually dismantling that narrative and putting together what I think is the real narrative. And I suppose, it moved then to, well, we tell a story about our country as well. So there's the country story, and it's a story that you believe. I bump into contemporaries of mine who still roughly believe the story of this country as they were taught it in the history books during apartheid. They still believe in the broad contours of that story. So I thought, okay, let's re-examine. And I wanted to re-examine the recent past and see, what is the evidence, scrutinize it, and then move into, I was now going to write a new kind of nonfiction. I'd always been a novelist before, but I was hoping to bring that novelist's eye to the realities of South Africa as well. So it's a composite of writing processes that led to Rattling the Cage, obviously grounded in the journalism of the last 20 years.
And what I didn't mention in my introduction when I was introducing you, Brent, is that, of course, you're also co-editor of Ground Up, which is a very important online newspaper detailing people's more grassroots experience, and I think gets us more to the bottom of South African lived experiences, which you also talk about in the book. But how did you find that being the co-editor of a publication like Ground Up actually influenced you to writing this Rattling the Cage in the way that it did, if at all?
It definitely did, and I reference Ground Up constantly throughout the book. It's really sort of the coalface of South African reality that I have, as opposed to the macro political institutionalized politics, which a lot of our media focus primarily on, which is obviously very important as well. But the ground up experience and the raw copy coming in, a lot of it that doesn't even make it into the public, but also the stories that are told and the things that we found profoundly influenced me. And I think that part of the idea of the title as well, Rattling the Cage, is exactly that, is to maybe shake people a little bit out of their complacency, both in terms of being too sure of the narrative of South Africa's history that they want to tell themselves, the narrative that they choose to believe, and also just the dire, gut-wrenching poverty, which I think is the main, should be our biggest concern in this country, and that informs every essay in the book.
Yes, and we'll get to that. But I just, just going back to the sort of autobiography a little bit. I mean, in the introduction, you also talk about your early time as a young idealist of Parliament. And I was wondering how that time, and I mean, I peripherally knew you then, is how that time actually shaped your views on South Africa now, and also writing this book, because I think, as you say, as you imply, we're the sum total of all our lived experiences, and it does strike me as, when you talk about the real stories and also the lies that we tell ourselves, whether it's about the childhood made up or whether it's about our country, and we'll get to that later. But talk to us a little bit about that time as an idealist in Parliament, what you thought you could achieve, and now looking back, I mean, you describe yourself as, I think it's you're not young enough to know everything yet, and I think that applies to all of us, to know everything anymore. Yeah.
Yes, I also yes, I'm no longer young enough to know everything. And,
yes,
I'm old enough to suspect everything, which is the old Oscar Wilde witticism.
Yes,
and so yes, I do suspect everything. And I'm on the cusp of that age, where one's radical heart is giving sway to a mellowing, more conservative brain, as it has been described. Yeah. So yes, as a young idealist, we considered my little stint there for 1 year. It was brief. It was a very fast year, and it was part of a national election campaign, the 2004 elections. I found I got a close-up, very, very close-up look at the inner workings of opposition politics and of the parliamentary system, and it was a rewarding and highly informative period. So yes, that certainly has informed a lot of the work.
Okay, so Brent, I'm going to start off with, clearly in the book, the Constitution is also, if the stories of Ground Up that have influenced you, the Constitution runs like a fine thread throughout this book, whether on dignity, on inequality, and so on. And particularly the start of the book, so I want us to talk a little bit about that, because you talk in the book about, and people need to go and read these wonderful essays themselves. They are accessible, they are critical, and they are interesting. So the political milieu that we're in at the moment, every day you have attacks on the judiciary from within the ruling party. I've just also seen something on my phone with Freedom Under Law calling for the suspension of Judge Hlophe in the Western Cape High Court, and so on. So there seem to be a number of issues at play here. And talk to us about this idea that, which we saw a bit in the Fees Must Fall movement, of Mandela being a sellout, and that actually this constitution is not worth the paper it's written on, because look at everything that's going on. Your thoughts on that as you started to distill this in the book in a very important way, I think.
Yeah, well, I could speak for several hours answering that question alone. I think that the Constitution was the blueprint that we were for the country, and it was negotiated through those talks from after 1994, and then became a reality in 1996. And I mean, I would agree with Ace Magashule that it isn't sacred, and of course it can be altered and has already been altered, several times, and that nothing is absolutely cast in stone. The problem is that it's being treated with suspicion, and the suspicion with which it's being treated is being exploited for other people's political agendas and things that they want to, and truths that they wish to hide. So the suspicion around the Constitution and around the accusations against Mandela and the 1994 political settlement is that somehow this Constitution is a foreign imposition on South Africa and an African country, and it contains alien values. But the people voicing those suspicions are very happy with certain provisions of it, but of course they want to change things that suit them and suit their, I would say, very narrow interests, which and also gain political power through spinning this narrative. So and it's becoming more and more clear that two narratives are beginning to emerge, and you can see that focused in the factions within the ANC, and also the fallout from the Zondo Commission. So the question which I ask in the book, and which the book basically investigates going back to 1994, is that all the problems that we face in South Africa today, the stark reality and this grinding poverty and all the other things that I could add to that, is that the fault of a democratically elected political class that has betrayed its values and become extremely corrupt, and is it the corruption and state capture? And then there's an opposing narrative that wants to blame everything on that constitutional settlement, on the neoliberal economic policies that South Africa followed, and that so-called white monopoly capital, and it's still referring to that. I mean, I think that term had use and made sense in 1994. I don't think it makes sense anymore. We have rainbow monopoly capital. Is still pulling the strings silently in the background, and that is the cause of all our woes. So those are the two, broadly speaking, the two narratives that are being pushed by political forces in the country, and the book investigates the histories and origins of those two narratives. That's a thread that runs right through it. My own view on the Constitution, which I think you wanted me to get to. My own view on the Constitution is that it was done through an amazing amount of consultation at the time. The interruption of those Cadessa talks by the AWB when they drove through the window really reminded me of the storming of the Capitol that we saw in Washington, DC.
Yes.
There were lots of similarities in the hooliganism, and the anger and the white supremacy. The Constitution is not the cause of our problems. It is a remarkable document, and it is the means of enabling us to get to a better South Africa. And it envisages a social democratic state with social economic rights, a very important contribution to constitutionalism, which arises not through some foreign imposition, but actually has its roots in Black, African, and Caribbean intellectuals who questioned the whole Enlightenment project and the rights of man, and said, yes, well, you have the rights of man, but you don't allow slavery on the soil of France, and you don't allow slavery on the soil of Britain, but you allow it everywhere else in the world, and colonialism. And so Africa and the South made enormous contributions to the humanist project and pointed out the contradictions in European Enlightenment. And that's why we landed up with social economic rights in the end. So it's this idea that these are European ideas that have been packaged and put into this envisaged nation state that's somehow alien to man here is something I think we can debunk.
And just to bring it closer to young people, I mean, what I've found, and I also wrote about this in my own book, is on the Fees Must Fall movement, and you write about it very eloquently in your book, and around art and the right to speak. But young people, it seems that young people feel betrayed by the struggle, and have also used the Constitution as a kind of outlet to say, actually this neoliberal document, we want nothing to do with it. Well, we want some, as you say, for some purposes we do. But that, to me, I also found curious and in a way disappointing, and perhaps another way in which democratic South Africa's education system has let us down. And you also talk about that in the book.
Well, I mean, the youth have been betrayed, and they're quite right about that. The movement is broad, and there are many different divisions even within it, and there were people with ulterior political motives and people who got more and more involved in Fees Must Fall, and we know that there were leaders that were being paid by people outside of the movement. And the narrative was being steered in certain directions at certain times, and there was personal animus playing a role in some of the university protests. So there were all kinds of things going on. But the idea of dismissing the Constitution as something that has betrayed the youth is, that it's not a case that can actually be proven, and I think it's a very, very shallow reading. But it is quite clear that they have been betrayed by the political elite, and by and which reached extraordinary proportions during the Zuma government presidency. In terms of the state capture and the corruption that went on, lower estimate 250 billion, upper estimate 500 billion. And also we know that an underlying force of the Fees Must Fall protest was that the university has become an extension of the welfare state. And when your child grant runs out at 18, how would you next be looked after financially? It is then at university that you go and you will be cared for corporally and intellectually. And that's what we've seen, is the universities taking on more and more of that kind of burden of support. Accommodation, food, lodging, free fees, and everything around that. But the feeling that the youth are betrayed is absolutely true, and they write about that, and we can see it in the demographics of our electoral system, where the number of people between the age of 18 and 21 who registered for the 2019 election is a fraction of the number of people in that age bracket that were registered in the previous election. So that really is an indictment of the system. So you can't say, oh well, young people aren't interested in politics, when you had a much higher figure before of young people. So the young people are getting disenchanted with the politics and are moving away from it, and they're not seeing that through the democratic processes they are getting the results that they need. And that's unsustainable. So that in our last election, we had, was it 17 million people voted, and 20 million eligible voters, either registered or not registered. But 20 million people didn't vote.
Yes, and I think that's it's a harbinger of of things to come, and it's quite it can be, that's discouraging. And especially, I suppose, this year as we face a local government election, where will that turnout sit? But Brent, I want to go back to your mentioning of the storming of the Capitol, because you took that sort of question out of my mouth. But because I think that some of these issues around the Constitution, attacking the founding document, attacking the structures of democracy, it's South Africa's, we're not alone here. And if you look at what happened in the United States on the 6th of January, this is, it's people who say, who are upset or disillusioned with the system and don't believe that the rules really serve them. And so what's the point of it? And we can throw it out the window. And so how do you see, and it's interesting, your mentioning of youth politics, that's also not something new special to South Africa. So how do you see us fitting into what you've written about in this book, fitting into that global context where democracy is, in my view, under threat? And as you mentioned in the book rightly, it's sort of the best way we have of organizing ourselves. The alternatives are too ghastly to mention. But there is a movement in the world which is kind of anti for want of a better word, democratic, or wanting and a creeping sort of authoritarianism. Some comment on that in terms of South Africa's future, I would say.
Yes, I think that, the situation, it's the classic case again, and we saw this in America, is that people with, and I'm not talking about the white supremacists, I'm talking about people that don't have jobs, that, that really can't pay for their kids' education or fix their teeth anymore, as the middle class in America used to be able to do. And are also getting evicted from their homes because of enormous financial mismanagement at the macro level by the banks and the financial crisis of 2008. And most of this anti-democracy is the fallout from 2008 coming home to roost. Also, the complete hash that George Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld made of the Middle East, so that you landed up with enormous migration, and also trillions of rand of debt, trillions of dollars for the American government. And then it becomes the classic case that people with real grievances, and this is true in South Africa as well, unfortunately have a habit of backing exactly the wrong kind of disruptor, who's anti-democratic and who they think is on their side. Now, Trump was elected, and look how hard it was to get rid of him. But eventually he did go. And that's the point of a democracy, is that the point of a democracy is not that it gives us the most likable, even the best, or even the most efficient government. The point of a democracy is it's the only system that we have which allows you to get rid of a government once you're sick and tired of it and once it's made a mess. And did the same thing with Mbeki. South Africa turned on Mbeki with a vengeance because of they became more and more suspicious of his intellect and of the mess he had made of HIV, and also the neoliberal economic policies. And he had alienated the left to a very large extent, and he had bullied them quite a bit and treated them with disdain. And then, of course, what happens, the left threw its weight behind, again, the wrong kind of disruptor. And that was Zuma, who then didn't implement any of the things that they had hoped he would do, became less people-centered, in fact, and has really imploded the economy and all the gains that we had made up until 2008. So he backpedaled the entire country. So we're now sitting in the same position economically after the apartheid government had completely destroyed the finances of this country. We clawed our way back from 1994, all the way back from junk status to actually investment grade, and we had all our fundamentals in place. Not that was helping the poor. That's a whole other discussion that I have in the book about how would poor people are not interested in your GDP figure. The connection, you can have very high GDP and it makes no difference to the person who's homeless. So that's I think what's happening, and immigration's playing a big role, and I'm deeply disturbed at how the anti-immigrant thing is taking off in South Africa as well. And that for me is a terrible disturbance, and it's also against our constitution, frankly.
Absolutely. I'd just like to remind people who are listening in and watching is that you can post some questions in the chat, and I do have one from Solly Moang. Solly says, young people also question the bona fides of Mandela, and don't you think that it's the responsibility of those who were there during the multi-party negotiations to unpack the climate at the time? And he goes on to say the silence of those who were there at the time, their failure to provide information to counterbalance the revisionist tendencies, gives reasons for all the false narratives. Brent, do you have a comment on that before we go on? I'd like to talk about your chapter on dignity and humiliation, which I think is a really nuanced and interesting chapter. But in a way, you talk about this misinformation, you talk about that is also a thread in the book, and whose responsibility is it to rectify misinformation that is out there, fake news, all of that?
I agree with Solly completely, and it is true that maybe they haven't been vocal enough about it, but there has been some unpacking, and I think we've reached a time now where sufficient time has passed for us to reinvestigate these things, and I hope that I'm part of that discussion with this book, and maybe other people will, because there's been a very strong knee-jerk reaction initially, and I mean, going back to Saint-Peter Blanche's work and various other writers who made it very, very clear that they saw the 94 constitutional settlement as an elite, a pact of elites. And that was then prejudicial to the future of the country. And then we look at how the RDP was basically, killed in the crib, the RDP program. And then we go into this neoliberal economics. And then there was a knee-jerk reaction, has always been, to that. And I certainly agreed with it at the time, and saying, well, yes, but all the alliance partners went along with it. They didn't walk out of the room. They carried on. They agreed to go along with it. In fact, they helped write the policy, and then ministers from the South African Communist Party and people from the trade unions all implemented neoliberalism in their own way. So yes, so I would hopefully this book is contributing to that debate. But interesting you say about young people, Solly, and that what I didn't expect, and what I've been hugely encouraged by, is how many people from so-called Generation Z, which I don't like that term at all, because it sounds like it's the last generation, and of course it won't be, or the born frees, which is another term that is also not inaccurate, because nobody's born free, and certainly not people after 1994 with the apartheid legacy. But I've had such a good response from them, which I really didn't expect, and people are so I hope I'm part of that discussion.
Excellent. But Brent, I want to actually circle back to the Constitution and that conversation, because we talked about Jacob Zuma, the appalling, his disregard of the Zondo Commission. But in your book, you say somehow we have to hold the course and resist the populist, nationalist, illiberal backlash that has followed the subsequent decline of our economy. And so you clearly are still a believer, as I am, in the Constitution as a founding document and a lodestar. But how do we protect and defend this Constitution? I mean, it's the old question that if tomorrow it was under attack, as I think it is now, who is going to march in defense of the Constitution? How do we actually hold the course? I mean, that I think is a big question, but some thoughts from you on that.
Well, I think, all constitutions and frameworks like that are constant, and democracy as well. If you want to have a constitutional democratic state, you are constantly going to be fighting encroachments on that, whether it is undermining the Fourth Estate, as we have seen, whether it's people wanting to change the actual document itself for various purposes. Whether it's just in the breakdown and the hollowing out of the institutions that are meant to implement the Constitution. It's a living thing. It's a living document, and it's always been about making it a living reality. and realizing the kind of country envisaged in the constitution that we would like to live in. So that's the answer to fighting for the constitution. How we resist is we have to resist demagogues, and I'm afraid they get very hard to resist when your economic outcomes are poor, and when the economy is failing and people are suffering. So in South Africa, we have 5 million people living in shacks. We have over 7 million people looking for work. We have 1 million farm laborers who've been evicted from their homes since 1994. We have 2 in every 3 children living on child grants. That is a very, very bleak scenario that I've just painted, and that is what has to be addressed. Without that, we will fall into more and more populist rhetoric and traps. I do think that South Africans aren't stupid, though, and I'm always encouraged by how people see through quite a lot of the populist. Saying we'll give you this if you vote for us. The more dangerous thing is when people find scapegoating. That's more dangerous to resist. If a populist walks down to one of the informal settlements and says, "Hey, if you vote for me, I'll give you, every one of you will have a house in 10 years," they're not going to believe him any more than they believe the current government, and won't vote for that. But they will vote if the messaging is done in a way that appeals to people's fundamental outrage at the current indignities that they suffer, and if they can then blame somebody. And that's where the rhetoric becomes very, very dangerous. At the moment, we are in a fortunate position that the faction in the ANC that has the upper hand, and I don't agree with a lot of his policies, and I don't agree with him on all kinds of things, but we do have an ally in the current president in terms of supporting the constitution. And he is a constitutionalist, and he is supporting that. So that's why I would think that we're not in, that's a very powerful ally to have.
And also, Brent, I suppose your work at Ground Up is also what I always find encouraging as well, is that people are prepared they use their rights, and the extent to which they know their rights, in a sense. It might be, not in the more, maybe in a higgledy-piggledy fashion, but they understand that there is a right to certain things, and that there is an element of wanting to see that happen, and people are still fighting and shouting about it. And it's sort of, Cato Regan once said, when we're silent, and when people stop doing that, then we know we're in trouble, that they're not clamoring or protesting or doing things. So I guess that's also another part of it. But the other thing I found interesting, Brent, was you talk about the solutions to our country, or that it will require a lot. It will take a lot of thinking, and that might sound sort of, but yes, because I think what your book tries to do is it tries to, as you say, you move from sort of being a young idealist into a more nuanced position where you kind of see the other side and you think, well, yes, maybe. And it does seem as if, and perhaps, and social media adds to this, is that there isn't a lot of thinking often, is that a lot of our public debate is sometimes unthinking and it's unnuanced. And how do we get, and perhaps just explain, through the book, how you reached a point of kind of nuance, but how do we encourage real thinking and deep thinking about the challenges of our country, which I think is often missing in the policy debate, which we don't really have that much in South Africa.
Yeah, there are many approaches to that. I just want to say that I think I'm better at analyzing things than I am at proposing solutions, and I wouldn't presume.
It's a big club of us.
I wouldn't presume to be able to prescribe on all of these things at all.
No.
I can certainly say that. The keeping the conversation going, is very important, and that's my little contribution to this. And perhaps what people need more than anything else are the facts. They need the facts. They need information. I'm a great believer in transparency. Transparency is essential, and the more we know and the more knowledge that you equip people with, the better things are. And also an education system that teaches people to really think and to analyze things for themselves. So if we get our education system into better shape, and our universities do their job, and incubate for us people who have insights and can shape the future policy, the future leaders, the future judges, lawyers, constitutionalists, I hope, of this country. I mean, that's, let's start with that. Let's start with transparency, information, and the education system. Let's try and hold off on social media a little bit.
How do we do that?
Well, that's a responsibility for each and every one of us. And as we all know, don't tweet it unless you know that it's you're sure of it. And if you do tweet it by accident and find out that it wasn't true, make as much effort as you possibly can retweeting that this isn't that this wasn't, that you were also caught.
Exactly.
So, and also not throwing petrol on the fire, rather, trying to, let's coax the fire into something that is meaningful and useful. But I do think that what your experience of South Africa since 1994 is, if you felt included or if you felt excluded and marginalized, if you don't have a job and you're living in a shack, if you are getting great, wonderful contracts and you're driving around in your brand new Maserati and have a mansion, the narrative about the transition and what has happened in South Africa, some of which one you choose to believe in, I think may well be something to do with your experience of that transition. And I think that's what people have to look out for. I also think that people have human beings have always had a very precarious relationship with truth. And not necessarily, as we've seen with QAnon and various other things in the United States, they're not necessarily very interested in the truth because it doesn't necessarily suit them.
Brent, we've got questions from Emily Schaffer, but I want to just, before that, I go to that, so keep your questions coming if you have them, is the chapter on dignity and humiliation. For me, part of that is also about accountability. And I mean, you talk here about Jacob Zuma and you talk about the spear debacle. And I mean, I found a fascinating chapter. And you talk about South Africa's long history of humiliation, colonialism, slavery, apartheid, etc. But and I want your comment on this, because I think some of it just reminds me of this this Ankie Krog's poem, Country of Grief and Grace. And at the end, she says, but if the old is not guilty, does not confess, then of course the new can also not be guilty, not be guilty, nor be held accountable if it repeats the old. Things may then continue as before, but in a different shade. And it struck me that a lot of that, that sort of just encapsulates for me a lot of what you were trying to say in this chapter about humiliation. And it struck me that it also has some resonance on the changing of the name of Port Elizabeth and the comments and the sort of debate that's been out there around that. So maybe just speak a little bit about this, constructing this chapter, which I think you've done in a really interesting way.
Right. So what I start off with is, this concept of dignity, which basically underpins all the values of the Constitution, and it arises after the Second World War, after huge categories of people were treated as Untermensch, under people, and constitutionalists then after World War II realized that we now get the dignity is going to be rooted in the individual, and it is from that, just by being an autonomous human being, you have dignity, and from that dignity flows all those basic human rights. And now we've developed that to socioeconomic rights as well. So it is the golden thread that runs through the Constitution, and it is something which is constantly invoked. It was invoked by Jacob Zuma when Brent Murray did a satiric picture of him. It's regularly evoked. My dignity is being impinged. But it's a very funny kind of quality. And it's one that's very hard to define. And so I spend a number of pages trying to understand what is this strange thing called dignity. And it doesn't even have a legal definition, not that I'm aware of. And it seems to, unlike, if somebody hits you or steals from you or abuses you, the violation of your right is apparent and clear. How your dignity is impinged upon does seem to be more subjective, and it seems to arise out of how you feel you've been treated, or how you should have been treated, and sometimes it's also in the eye of the beholder. So it's a funny kind of quality, and yet it's at the root of everything in terms of our rights, and more law as we are making hate speech laws, as we are making more and more law around dignity. So trying to get to grips with that, I thought was a very important element to everything in South African life, and its counterpart is humiliation being removal of your dignity, and whether that means you are living in a place without any sanitation, and you have to share a communal toilet, or you're a kid going to one of our schools that doesn't have toilets and you have to dig a pit latrine, or you have to go out into the field. These are issues of humiliation of your dignity. And I think it's it's a strong animating force in much of our politics and in much of the protests that we see. And then why I concentrated on the incident of the spear was I wanted to show how dignity can be invoked and abused for political ends. And the president's has, let's say, the president has full right to dignity, obviously, but the protection of that dignity, the standards are definitely not the same as they would be for other people. So I look at,
And I mean, at the end of this chapter, you have, and we won't give away the entire book, but I mean, there's a lovely, you talk about this lack of dignity and the taxi driver, and in a sense, do we see that that lack of dignity, the humiliation in the eyes of every single person at a traffic light, begging at a car, that sort of thing. And I mean, you talk about it, you talk about the young taxi man at the end of this, and you say no blue light brigades, no personal bodyguards, no presidential jet for him. And that sort of is the story of South Africa writ large. But I'm going to come to Emily's question. She says, outside, we're going back now to sort of pure politics. Outside of the traditional tripartite alliance, which stakeholders and players can positively influence the current corruption or constitutional crisis? As a business, diplomacy from third countries, what grassroots political campaigns do you see as effective? And I might just add, I mean, the question about the current corruption situation, but I don't believe we're in a constitutional crisis. What we need to do is stave it off. But I don't believe we're in one at present. But you might want to comment on that and on Emily's question.
Well, I think that there's certainly an attempt being made to manufacture a constitutional crisis.
Yes.
But in the true sense of what a constitutional crisis really is, we haven't got there yet. And I'm thinking there are actually several paths to a real constitutional crisis in this country. Yes. Which may involve several branches, primary branches of our institutions, both the judiciary and the executive and the legislative. But outside of, I mean, everybody's got a role to play, in this, in looking at corruption. I mean, just as individual citizens, we've all got a role to play in that, and not to contribute to it, and to be aware of when we are indulging in that, because corruption is pervasive, and it exists in the private sector. For every public corruption, there's a private sector counterpart very often. In fact, corruption is probably one of the most successful public-private partnerships we have seen since 1994. But also, I mean, outside of the alliance, the NGOs have been playing an incredible role in bringing facts to light, and we report a lot on them at Ground Up. They play civil society plays a very important role, and so do opposition politics. Certainly the EFF and the DA and the FF Plus. They've all got their constituencies. They've all got people in South Africa who want to voice their concerns. They all have legitimate concerns. They have other ones that I would question, as much as I would question the ANC governments. So certainly our political bodies play a role. Our lawyers seem to play an extraordinary large role. Yes. In South Africa, and then obviously the judiciary as well. I think those are sort of the primary. I don't know if there's the idea is that outside. I wasn't sure. Emily was saying other third countries.
Yes, from third countries, I suppose. Through diplomacy, I guess she means. So interventions from whether it's more established democracies, I suppose she means. I suppose, I mean, less so in South Africa that would gain traction. I suspect, I mean, democracy it is sort of the bottom up stuff, which is why I think Ground Up is so interesting, because it really is telling the stories that perhaps some of the mainstream media don't pick up on. And then they do pick it up, and then it gains traction. But Brent, I want to talk a little bit. This book was also, it's a time of COVID-19 and the pandemic in a world turned completely upside down, where also there've been incursions of rights in the name of dealing with the pandemic, but also that you've seen the role of the media also at this time, which has been a kind of good, bad, mixed, and so on. And I mean, you talk about the media. I mean, you are a journalist. That's your hat. And so just some thoughts from you about the role of the media, well, in a time of disinformation, but also in a time of a pandemic, and how the media responds to perhaps sometimes overreaching by politicians in the name of the greater good.
Yeah, again, it's patchy, like all these things. It's very, very patchy, and I wouldn't generalize, because we've got pockets of absolute excellence in the media. We've also got, I would like to congratulate SABC News and also the both television and even more radio, the extent to which that organization has turned itself around into far better journalism than it was doing for quite a while. So that that's been a very positive factor. There are other organizations that I think have fallen down rather badly in the last while, and there clearly is more and more. Maybe it's just us, becoming I don't want to say like the rest of the world, but in some ways we are. There's more of a plurality of voices that people always talk about, but by that I really mean there's just more and more different perspectives, and there's more and more. Under the American model, there are more and more media outlets that are, pushing particular ideas and knowingly, I think, are not always writing the truth and are skewing narratives to suit them. And then, of course, we had our security, state security agencies playing a role in funding. And that's deeply disturbing. I think we should all worry about that. And then there's been incredibly sophisticated projects of planting information in the media, and that's why I'm always amused by people talking about the media, they got this agenda of white monopoly capital.
Yes.
They affront for all kinds of nefarious things. But in fact, the irony being that the two biggest major media scandals since 2008 in South African media were both in the interests of the state capturers, and that the manipulation is actually the successful fake news manipulation was actually working directly in the opposite direction to what the media are always being accused of being the front for. So I think that's, and I also think we're seeing many more voices, and Ground Up has certainly been a part of that. I do think that we voices that were marginalized and weren't being heard are coming more and more into the fore. So there's a lot to be positive about, and there's a lot to be worried about. And especially when we start hearing about things like media tribunals and that journalists need to get licensed and take their license away, like a doctor with malpractice. All kinds of, I think, appallingly bad ideas are getting out there. But it's also becoming more and more sophisticated in terms of the fake news and in terms of what people are frighteningly able to do now with technology. So educating, becoming more and more media literate, media literacy is something I think that all countries maybe need to make part of the school curriculum at this stage. Is that media literacy might have to be part of your training for life now, because it's a very complex and confusing world, and it's very easy to fake stuff. We've seen that coming out. I mean, look at, you virtually had a war in Eastern Europe because of it.
Absolutely. And so we're getting to sort of the end of our time, Brent, but I wanted to, I really enjoyed the why aren't you a vegan? And I suppose you're going to ask me that question, but it's a great chapter. But I also want to just talk about just you've got your part 6 as love and compassion, because you tie these emotions, but climate change in South Africa, it seems as if we are slightly behind the conversations about it because there's so many other competing priorities. How do we, some thoughts on climate change, the way we're dealing with it, and also how we can use it as a way of actually, as a job creator, as more green shoots, literally, around us in the economy and so on. It seems as if we're not really grasping and understanding that, but there are pockets of it which are interesting, where people are getting involved. And so just your thoughts on that, because I think it's really interesting that you weave this into your book, because it's so often, climate is forgotten, although it is one of the burning issues of our time.
Literally burning issue. And climate change has to be put front and center. It is the biggest challenge. If people think COVID is a problem, climate change is a much bigger problem and a much greater existential threat to humanity and to all of us. And therefore, and it's not getting the kind of attention that it needs to get. And that is we have to look to the youth, because they are the ones who are going to have to live on this planet and survive. And as I say in the book, the prospects at the moment are extremely bleak, but fight we must for survival. It's a question of survival for a billion people on the planet at least are in immediate and present danger, and it's going to happen. It's happening much quicker than people thought, and it's going to speed up. And yet there is the opportunity here, and it's been written about, and it's been seen by the greatest international organs that we have, like the United Nations. Now, United Nations spent ages warning everybody that one day there's going to be a little hocha that's going to appear, and it's going to cause a pandemic, and it's going to kill millions of people, Omicron's going to spread all over the world, and you need to be ready. You need to do the following things. So, those things were not done. After the MERS scare and a couple of the avian flu and that, they stopped the vaccine factories. They just closed it all down. Oh, the worst case scenario didn't happen. It was like the millennium, the millennium Y2K bug.
Yes.
So let's just ignore it. And the United Nations has also made it very clear how this can be done and how you are going to need to use the big institutional financial framework of the country, and you have to deploy resources for it. And there's a lot of very good thinking. There are a lot of people have developed roadmaps. The green economy is a completely viable and realistic approach. I mean, it's not. One has to avoid the cartoons of it, where people say, "Oh, well, we just shut down all the coal stations tomorrow and we'll be fine because wind and sun will be sufficient." Well, that isn't the case. But we can certainly work on our transition. We can certainly work on cleaning up our act. And there's so many opportunities there, and opportunities for a country like South Africa. So, so I'm just saying that, don't vote for any politician or anybody who's in charge of anything significant if they do not have an answer, if they do not have a plan. Now that plan might change, but they need to have a plan at least, and they need to be implementing it. And I know we're getting over COVID, which for me in many ways revealed so much. You can draw very interesting lines between our response to COVID, both internationally and in South Africa, and the climate change crisis. And I think we have to look at COVID-19 as sort of a dry run for severe effects of climate change, and how are we going to deal with that? As I say, the roadmaps are there. People just need to become more and more aware of it, and there's a role for the media to play. We should all be writing about it.
And also, it's interesting you talk about this, your green jobs, and sort of in the United States, the Green New Deal, or, people sort of pillory it, and actually it is the way to go. But again, Brent, I think we get stuck in these binaries, and you talk about it in the book, good, bad, black, white, and it's just most of these solutions are somewhere in the middle, in a grey middle often. But if your book is anything, it's about trying to overcome those binaries and trying to get us to think more imaginatively about our country. I think we've sort of run out of time, exhausted it, but there's lots more to talk about. And I mean, it's, you talk about service delivery issues, and again, the chapters on where you talk about the media, about crime, about education. It really is a very wide-ranging selection of topics. But I think what I appreciated about the essays was this critical thinking, the lens that you bring to this book. You bring the thoughtfulness, but also an empathy for our country and empathy for its people and where we are at the moment. And so, Brent, it's been really great to be in conversation with you. And for those of you who are listening in and you haven't had an opportunity to get the book, here it is, Rattling the Cage. It really is a very insightful read about our country from somebody who is both sensitive and empathetic about some of our most difficult issues. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Pan MacMillan and also to Brent, who is national treasure, dare I say. Brent, thank you so much.
Thank you, Judith. That's very kind.
Thanks everyone.